I'm actually starting right now. Okay, there we go. I pressed the button by accident, but now we've started.
There you go.
Mazel tov. All right. We actually have an action-packed class today. We are going to do a general introduction to the topic of our discussion. We are going to read the last paragraph of our 12-chapter discourse that we are, God willing, finishing today. We are going to do a short review then of chapter 12, and then we are going to take questions and whatnot. So we are, God willing, with the help of God, we are finishing the actual discourse today. Next week we are going to take a week for reviewing the whole discourse, just to give sort of an overview of everything that we learned, because we've been learning it for a very long time. And then the week after that, God willing, we are going to start the next thing. That's the plan. Okay, so without further ado, tonight's introduction that I'm going to give is based on this. I didn't know if there were going to be any Hebrew speakers or Hebrew readers here tonight. Anybody that wants a copy of this, I can make you a copy. That's why I brought it. But there is no English translation. So if I don't know who wants one, who doesn't want one. If anyone wants one, that's great. If no one wants one, that's fine. Either way, this is what tonight's class is based on. It's actually it's one page from a talk of the Rebbe, but it's sort of action-packed. The last paragraph of our mimer, which just sort of slips in here. The Tzemach Tzedek sort of just stuck this in here. It's about 3 lines in the Hebrew, very, very short. And the Tzemach Tzedek connects what our chapter has been about, which is the idea that God is beyond time. The Rebbe connects that idea with the question or the topic, the famous topic in Jewish sources about knowledge and free choice, about the divine omniscience, God's knowledge of everything that takes place, God's perfect knowledge, and the idea that nevertheless we have free choice, at least to the extent of making moral choices regarding the mitzvahs, regarding the divine commandments in our lives. L'chaim. This topic is a classic in Judaism. Everybody and their uncle has something on knowledge and choice. It's a perennial. It's a question that is always asked and never perfectly answered. Even the Tzemach Tzedek, as we even read last week, he's going to give just a little bit. We're going to touch a little bit on this topic. Anybody who says that they're getting to the full depths is probably out of it's beyond their pay grade. They're a bit out of their element. Because as we are going to discuss, the Rambam himself, Maimonides, one of the greatest Jewish thinkers of all time, he himself writes in his code that this question is not a question that can be simply answered. Not a question that he can just write the answer down simply in his code. So without further ado, it says in Pirkei Avos, it's actually just part of something that Rabbi Akiva says. It's about 4 words in Hebrew. Rabbi Akiva says in Pirkei Avos, chapter 3, Mishnah 15, he says, all is foreseen, but free choice is granted. Now, that translation is a little bit of a finesse, because that's not exactly what it says in the Hebrew, if you are doing a literal translation. But according to many of the commentaries, that's exactly what it means. That's what it's talking about. The standard commentaries, if you read the Bartanura, for example, that is what it's saying. Rabbi Akiva says that all is foreseen, and yet free choice is granted. God knows everything that is going to occur before it occurs. God has perfect knowledge of everything, including the future. And yet, our choices are absolutely free. Moving ahead in history to the Rambam, who lives, give or take 1,000 years after Rabbi Akiva. And the Rambam says, very famously, in his Hilchos Tshuva, in his Laws of Repentance, chapter 5, he says as follows. I'm giving you the short paraphrase. The short paraphrase is as follows. Maimonides says, the Rambam says, there are 2 principles of faith that are in seeming contradiction. As we know, as we've spoken about before in this class, the Rambam was the codifier of the 13 principles of faith. And really, his 13 principles of faith are much more controversial than the basic overview implies, because until the Rambam, there really was no codified list of what Jews believe. And even after the Rambam, his 13 principles remain controversial. His 13 principles are by no means the be-all and end-all of this topic. On the contrary, they were really just a goad to further controversy. As soon as the Rambam had no sooner written his commentary on the Mishnah where the 13 principles are found, that people are disagreeing with him, and why 13? There should be fewer, there should be more, there should be different ones, why these, right? So in typical Jewish fashion. So the Rambam has two principles that seem to contradict. One of the Rambam's 13 principles of faith, the 13 things that all Jews believe, right? The 13 beliefs that are inherent to Judaism, according to the Rambam, one of them is called schar v'onesh. Schar v'onesh means reward and punishment. In other words, that God rewards and punishes the actions of man, right, in a just fashion. In other words, you are rewarded for the things you do right, and you are punished for the things you do wrong. Implicit in reward and punishment is the belief that we actually deserve the reward and punishment, and the only way that we can actually deserve the reward and punishment is if we have some choice in the matter. It is clear that if God compels us to do that which we are rewarded for or that which we are punished for, we do not deserve the reward and punishment. The reward and punishment are not due to us, the reward and punishment are not just. And so God would not give out a just reward and punishment if we did not have free choice, if we were not involved in our own actions, if it was just God acting through us, if we were pre-programmed robots of some sort or another, of a biological fashion, then obviously there is no principle of reward and punishment. The Rambam, for various reasons, you can go and read the Rambam for various reasons feels this is antithetical to Judaism, and he writes that on the contrary, God rewards us and punishes us justly for our actions for which we have choice. We decide what to do, and we are rewarded and punished based on our actions. Fundamental principle of Judaism. On the other hand, there is another fundamental principle of Judaism that says that God does not have a body, nor anything resembling a body, nor any parts. Implicit in this, according to the Rambam, as we have spoken about in this class before at length, although it was some time ago, implicit in this idea is the idea that God's knowledge is perfect. God has perfect knowledge of everything that takes place, right? Just one illustration of why this must be so is that if God does not have perfect knowledge, that means he must constantly be learning things. If God is constantly learning things, that means essentially that God is not the cause of everything, but that the things that are bringing him new knowledge are essentially causing changes within God. This is just one example. There's many different issues with the idea that God's knowledge is imperfect. That's just one issue. So God doesn't know that the cup in 3 seconds is going to be up in the air, and then I lift it up in the air, so I've actually just taught God something. God has acquired knowledge from me, which is a contradiction to his perfection. It's a contradiction to his unchanging nature. What does it mean that he has now changed? It means it would seem that he had a potential to know something that he didn't know before. Now that potential was actualized. There's all different ways you could put it, but the bottom line is that God has no body, he has no form of a body, he has no parts, and his knowledge is perfect. He does not change, and therefore his knowledge does not change. His knowledge is perfect and absolute. These two things.
That says that he must get bored.
I don't know what that means.
Nothing will change.
I don't know what that means. Boredom is a human weakness. Why would you ascribe to God boredom?
What, if nothing changes there, nothing is
If
new?
nothing changes, you get bored because you're expecting new things. God doesn't need new things. He doesn't need stimulation. The fact that you say that God needs to be stimulated to be perfect is itself a limitation on God. God doesn't need that stimulation. I'm just giving you the answer the Rambam would probably give you, at least in the Moreh Nevuchim. That's what he would tell you. He would tell you that the whole idea that you need something new to happen to keep you interested or to keep you awake is simply a human failing. It's part of our limitation. God doesn't need such things. God is constantly engaged. He doesn't have that limitation. That's what he would tell you. So God does not get bored.
What's he engaged in? That's what I'm going.
He's engaged with himself, as we'll touch on in a minute. He is engaged statically, but engaged nonetheless. It's a complicated topic. That's a fair question. We'll talk about that in a second, according to the Rambam. So these two principles, going back to our two principles, the principles of reward and punishment, which implies free choice, and the principle of God's perfection and unchanging nature, which implies a perfect knowledge of everything that takes place, these two ideas are in contradiction with one another. These two things are seemingly saying two opposite things about God, because how can it be that our knowledge, that our choice in our actions is fully free if there is a divine foreknowledge of our actions? God knows everything we are going to do before we do it. It would seem that what we are doing is so to speak, preordained, it is written, and therefore how can we be said to have free choice in the matters for which we are rewarded and punished? I would like to point out, just as an aside, and I really do mean this as an aside, I can't spend a lot of time on this evening, but just as an aside, nowhere in this whole scheme is it implied that everything that we do is by our free choice. And in fact, it is very likely, according to most Jewish sources, that the vast majority of what we do is not with free choice. The majority of what we do and the majority of what we experience is simply preordained by God. Right? Just like we say an animal does not truly have free choice, most of human life, which is an essentially animalistic pursuit, although not the same as the way an animal does it, obviously, but it has connections. It's related. It's of the same sort as an animalistic existence. Most of our animalistic existence is also without choice. These things, you cannot. Most of the things in your life cannot be chosen by you. All the Rambam is saying is that the things for which we are rewarded and punished, the divine commands, the moral choices we are expected to make in our own lives, in these things we must have free choice by the teachings of Judaism, by what the Torah says. That's what the Rambam says. And that seems to be in contradiction with the divine foreknowledge, the perfect divine knowledge of everything that will happen even before it takes place. I touched on this last week. We were talking about this at the end of the class last week. I also said last week, at the end of the class, that the Ravid, the famous commentator on the Rambam, who argues with a lot of what the Rambam says and comments in his glosses on the Mishnah Torah, on the Rambam's halachic code, he disagrees with a lot of what the Rambam says. And on this he has a famous comment. And his famous comment essentially says, why would pardon me, I didn't give the end of what the Rambam said, pardon me. The Rambam says, he says, in answer to this contradiction, he raises this contradiction between reward and punishment and divine foreknowledge, and he says the answer to this question is very important, and many great and lofty things hang off of it, and the answer to it is broader than the sea, and it's a huge topic. But essentially, we cannot know God, and we cannot know the way that God knows the world, and basically there is no answer to this question that I can write down. That's basically what the Rambam says. So the Ravid's commentary on this, the Ravid responds to the Rambam, and he says, it's very strange that the Rambam should raise the question, say it's a very important answer, and then not answer it, right? If you don't know the answer to the question, then don't raise it at all, or say you don't know. And if you know the answer to the question, you should answer it. What's this business of raising questions and then not giving answers? Raising questions you say you have the answer to, or that you understand something of the answer, and then you don't answer the question, right? This is very strange behavior. It's not usual.
Did the Rambam actually address the question?
No, the Rambam said the answer to the question is very important. But ultimately, we cannot know God, and I cannot answer it, basically. Is what
that was a short and sweet answer.
It's not really short and sweet in the relatively speaking. It depends, what's short and sweet to you. It's actually quite lengthy for the Rambam's terse language. There's another strange thing about it. The Rambam essentially says the answer to this is very important and it's very broad, but ultimately God's knowledge is beyond us because God and His knowledge are one, as we're going to touch on in a moment. And And essentially, I cannot know God's knowledge. We cannot know the way that God knows the world. And as such, I will not answer this question. The Ravid says very strange. It says non-answer, right? Non-answer. You raise the question and you don't answer it. What is this? Where is he learning this behavior? Like, where is this? Is this appropriate for a halacha work of the Rambam? The Rambam is telling a Jew how to live, and he's raising questions and not answering them. What is this, basically? The Ravid asks. The Ravid says, I will give something of an answer, he says. Something of an answer to this question, the Ravid says, which is interesting because the Ravid himself is immediately hedging, right? The Ravid himself is immediately saying, I'm not going to give the simple answer that is the answer to the question. He says, I'm going to give something of an answer. What the Ravid gives, what the Ravid alludes to, is the classic answer to this question. The old answer. The answer is quoted famously by the Tosfos Yom Tov, which is a commentary on the Mishnah, written by Rav Yom Tov Lipman Heller, I believe was his name. I may be mistaking his middle name and his last name, I can't remember. He was a student of the Maharal of Prague. He writes the answer to this question, and he's quoting the Midrash Shmuel, which is a much older sefer. And the Midrash Shmuel famously gives the following answer, and he gives it, the Midrash Shmuel gives the answer in the name of a certain Rav, I believe his name is Moses Almushninu, or Almushnino, who was a famous Rishon, probably a somewhat contemporary of the Rambam and the Ravid. And the answer that all these people give is as follows. The classic answer is that God does not exist within time. God exists outside of time. To God, what does that mean? It means that to God, everything that is going to happen has already happened. God is from a perspective where the past and the future are equal. It is not that the past has already happened and the future is yet to happen, but rather that everything is of the same level. Everything has already happened. He can see all events from outside of the whole system. And therefore, he knows what the person is going to do before they do it, even though they do it with a perfect free choice. Right? In other words, God has a knowledge of what you are going to do from the fact that you've done it. It's just that to him, you've done it already. Right? You've done it already. The same way that he knows what you did 3 weeks ago, and his knowledge that you did it 3 weeks ago doesn't affect your choice at all because it's something that's already happened, so too, he knows what you're going to do tomorrow in your moral choice. And to him, because from his perspective, it has already happened. That's all. So your choice is free because your choice from his perspective, has already been made, even though you have a free choice. This is essentially the classic answer to the question. The classic answer to the question is that God is outside of time. What is going to happen in the future has to him already happened, and so your choice is free, but he does not compel the choice. Your choice is free, but to him it has already happened.
He doesn't say anywhere that you will do this, you will do that, you will do the next thing.
No, exactly. Your choice is free. You're free to do whatever you want. He's not declaring that you are going to do something.
Bounce around time.
Exactly. He sees your free choice, which is not declared what you will do. He simply sees it as something that has already happened. That's the explanation.
So past, present, and future coexist.
Yes.
In the same blink of an eye.
Yes, correct. To God, yes.
There is no history. There might be history, but there's no. Future and history are really the same thing.
Right. In terms of his knowledge of them, yeah. In other words, there is really no future for him, but there's also really no past for him, right? Even the past is still happening. It's all together, right? So it's to him there is no future, there is no past. He's outside of time.
That's happening.
What do you mean?
He's just able to come in and look at what's going on. As like a supervisor from time to time come in and say, that's what you do now, and then he just goes back and does something else.
Well, either way, the point is that he is outside of it and can see it as if it has happened outside of time. He can see it as if it has already taken place. Now, so the question, if the answer is so simple, and our holy gathering here this evening is able to grasp the answer in about 3 minutes, and it's not so bad, right? It's not so bad. It's not so difficult, right? And the question becomes, so what's the Rambam's issue, right? The Rambam, to think that the Rambam, in his genius, the towering genius of the Rambam, couldn't think of this answer or had never heard of this answer, I assure you, is mistaken. And even the Ravid, who is critical of the Rambam for not giving the answer, even the Ravid says this is only a little bit of the answer. So the Ravid himself, who is saying just give the answer, himself realizes that the answer is the classic answer is there's something about the classic answer that gives them pause, that gives both of them pause. The Rambam, to the extent that the Rambam doesn't even write it, the Rambam just says the answer to this question is broader than the earth, which itself is a question. If the answer is broader than the earth, how did we just understand it in 3 minutes, right? And the Ravid, even though he says it with qualification, that this is the answer, this is a little bit of the answer, this is part of the answer, right? Now the question is, what's everyone's issue? What's wrong with the answer, right? This leads us to a whole new issue, yeah.
It's difficult, For them it was more difficult. We're sitting here with 2,000 years later of accumulated knowledge.
That's true. That is true.
They did not have a lot of that stuff.
That's true.
Like the space program, when it started, they didn't know what to expect.
Sure.
The same thing.
But there's nothing about this answer that is modern. There's nothing about this answer that.
We say we've learned more, so we've got all these different.
The Rav Mushnino, who said this answer, is a contemporary of the Rambam and the Ravid, and the Rav Mushnino is famous for giving this answer. The Rambam and the Ravid are famous for thousands of other things. In other words, the Rambam is essentially a leader of the entire Jewish people. Maybe if you were to rank Jews, which I don't see why anyone would rank great tzaddikim, which is not really anyone's place. But if you were, you would say that the Rambam is probably, if not in the top 5, maybe in the top 3 most influential Jews in history, right? And the greatest, with the vastest knowledge and knowledge of the entire Torah. He himself says, which at the time was taken as hubris and today is viewed with awe, that his book and the Chumash are the only 2 books that you need to know the entire Torah. That's all you need. You need the Chumash and the Rambam. The Rambam called his book Mishnah Torah, the second Torah. You need the Torah and the Rambam's Torah, and that's it. Right? It says on the Rambam's grave, from Moshe until Moshe there was no one like Moshe. Right? It's not a small thing to say when you think of some of the people that were between Moshe and Moshe, like the prophet Samuel and the prophet Ezekiel and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, right, and King David, right? It says from Moshe until Moshe there was no one like Moshe. Right? The Rambam is not a... So, in other words, the idea that the Rambam wouldn't know this answer that we were able to understand the outline of in about 5 minutes, and that is the answer that he is saying is broader than the earth, right? In its understanding, it seems it seems unlikely. Let's put it that way. It seems unlikely. So the question is, and even if you want to say that the Rambam didn't know the answer, this is the answer that the Ravid alludes to and says it's only a partial answer, right? So it's not an issue of... What
it's also saying is that maybe the answer is outside of time, because everything outside of Earth, or broader than Earth, is outside of earthly time, which is then beyond.
The fact that the Ravid alludes to the answer indicates that it's not they were ignorant of the answer. It's that this answer is not a satisfying one. The question is, why is it not a satisfying answer? So, as follows. The answer to why this particular approach is not satisfying to the Rambam's treatment of the issue, is not satisfying to the Rambam's mind, is actually given by the Rambam. Because immediately after the Rambam brings up this issue, he starts talking about God's knowledge. And he brings up the idea that we've spoken about before in this class, that God is the knower, the knowledge, and the known all at once, which is the Rambam's shorthand for saying that God and his knowledge are absolutely one. They are inseparable. And this is not something which the human mind can comprehend. God and his knowledge are absolutely one. In other words, if you'll recall, from the beginning of these classes, this is interesting that the end of the mimer here sort of ties back into to some of the earlier topics so well. If you recall, the Rambam's conception of God's knowledge is that God and his knowledge are absolutely one. There is no such thing really as God's knowledge. There is just God. And part of being God is that he knows everything. In other words, part of Godding, part of the act of Godding, which is one single act, involves knowing everything that is, right? Because if you recall, if God has a knowledge, says the Rambam, which is separate than him, then you have him and his knowledge, there's parts, which one of them is really God, which one of them is the overarching system. There must be a third thing which describes the system that encompasses God and his knowledge, right? It's a whole disaster if you say that God and his knowledge are not one. So the Rambam concludes it must be that God and his knowledge are one. There is just God. There really isn't God's knowledge. There's what we call God's knowledge is really just another name for God himself. There is his essence. His essence is utterly indivisible, and by dint of his essence, by virtue of being what he is, by virtue of knowing himself or being in himself, he knows everything. That's the Rambam's description of God. And this is the Rambam's shorthand for this concept is he is the knower, the knowledge, and the known all at once. He is the one who knows. He is the act or the faculty of knowing, and he is the object of his knowledge simultaneously. He is the knower, the knowledge, and the known all at once.
Is it thought that God is self-aware?
Not in the human sense of self-aware. No. God is nothing in the human sense, is another way of saying what the Rambam is saying. God is nothing in a human sense. Essentially, the way that God operates, that's the Rambam's whole point, the way that God operates cannot be known from the way a human being operates. So he knows everything specifically because his knowledge does not work the way that ours does. He knows everything simply by being, whereas we, simply by being, do not know anything, right? Except maybe ourselves, perhaps. God knows everything simply by being. So in other words, the way he works is different than the way we work fundamentally, and you cannot learn from one to the other. We essentially cannot understand the way that God knows, is the Rambam's point, right? Really, he's making a statement famously of negative theology. He's really saying what we can't know about God. When we say that God knows everything, what we really are saying is that he has no ignorance. He is ignorant of nothing. But to say he affirmatively knows implies that his knowledge is like human knowledge, which we cannot say. So the Rambam is actually saying really a negative statement. The Rambam is really saying that God cannot be known at all. All that we can say for sure is that he's not ignorant. He is not lacking knowledge. But to actually say that he knows would be ascribing a human attribute to him, which we cannot do. Right? So this is all we've been through this. It was a long time ago, though, in this class. So, in a sense,
really, God's knowledge is visceral.
God's knowledge is not visceral because God has no viscera. His knowledge is totally one with him. God's knowledge is essential. God's knowledge is of himself in every direction. It is of himself in every sense of the term, of himself. So, the Rambam says that God's knowledge is not separate from him at all. Now, that itself alone would perhaps not be so bad, because you could still say that even though God's knowledge is totally one with him, because he's outside of time, it never really changes. He knows everything all simultaneously by knowing himself, so his knowledge doesn't really change. The Rambam has kind of solved the issue, right? So you could still have this idea of human free choice. The problem comes when you realize that when you take the non-Rambam approach, or the, so to speak, the Kabbalistic approach, of which whether the Rambam was aware of it is very controversial. But if you take the Kabbalistic approach, which we've spoken about in this mimer, which, if you'll recall, is that God's knowledge is not one with him. God's knowledge is a sphira. God's knowledge of the world is an emanation, right? And this emanation from him, this light which he emanates, is really the source of the world. The world is created through this intermediary emanation, right? There is God, there is the world, and there is godliness, which is in between. One way you could describe this godliness as God's knowledge of the world, right? This should all sound like a review. So, when you bring that dimension into it, when you bring the Kabbalistic element or the Chassidic element into it, it says in Tanya, in the second part of Tanya, in chapter 7, that God's knowledge of everything, or godliness, this godly emanation, is the source of each and every individual creation. So God's knowledge is not just one with Him. According to the Rambam, God's knowledge is one with Him. According to the Kabbalah and Chassidus, God's knowledge is one with the world. God's knowledge, the world is derived. Each thing, where does the cup come from? The cup comes ultimately from God's knowledge of the cup. God's knowledge of the cup is what creates the cup. The godly emanation of each thing, the godly expression of each thing through the 10 spheros, as we've been describing all along, is the source of that thing. It is the process of the thing's creation. The soul of each thing is a divine emanation. That divine emanation is really what we call God's knowledge of the thing. Taking these two things into account, we now arrive at a much deeper and much more profound contradiction when it comes to the idea of divine foreknowledge, divine knowledge, and free will. Because once you take this idea into account, once you take into account the idea that God and His knowledge are not the exact same thing, but rather that God actually has an active knowledge of the creation, as the Kabbalah describes, and that His knowledge is intimately entwined with the creation, and that every creation is created through His knowledge, all of a sudden you realize that the free choice itself, right, the choice that everyone makes themselves, must all have its source in the divine knowledge. In other words, there is a huge issue with the Chassidic and Kabbalistic understanding, which says that God's knowledge of the thing does not derive from the thing, but rather the thing derives from God's knowledge. It's an inversion, it's backwards, right? So if you hold that God's knowledge of the thing follows from the thing, which is the logical approach. That's how it works for human beings, right? My knowledge of the cup comes from the cup, right? The cup causes my knowledge of the cup. So then a human being makes a free choice, and God is aware of that free choice. The action of the human being, the free choice, causes God's knowledge of the free choice. The only thing is that God is outside of time, so to Him all the choices have already been made, right? That was essentially the simple solution to the problem. But really, in the soul of Torah, in Pnimiyus Torah, we learn that the choices are not what cause God's knowledge of the choices. God's knowledge of the choices causes the choices. It's the opposite. It's the reverse. The choices do not cause God's knowledge of the choices. It's God's knowledge of what will be that brings everything into being in the first place. Everything that exists in our world, including the person, including the different choices they have, including the choices they make, they themselves derive from the divine knowledge. The divine knowledge is the source. God's knowledge of what you are going to do creates you doing it, right? It's the reversal. It's a reversal of the idea. And this leaves the free choice as an issue. Now, all of a sudden, free choice is a huge issue, right? How can a person make a free choice if it is God's knowledge of what they do, God's knowledge of everything involved, that is actually actively creating it?
Well, that part of that's true. Sticking to the thing that we learned in law, that is, why can't you murder somebody with free choice and to do that?
Yeah.
Because you're impacting on that person's free choice to do things himself. So that's where your limitations start coming from.
Sure, but the thing is that the choice is really not. It doesn't seem to be free, because God's knowledge is actually what creates the choice as you make it. Right? If you do choose to murder someone, God forbid, right? That very choice, the act of doing it, the thoughts that you have about it, the actual, the means by which you do it, the object, the subject, all of these things are created through God's knowledge of these things. In other words, your actions are created through God's knowledge of your actions, right? So now the question is how can it be free? How can I say that I'm the one that's really doing this? God not only knows it because it happened already, God knows it because He is actively creating it as it takes place from His knowledge. He knows it intimately as He creates it. He is making it so. So how is this not a predetermined? How is this not a fatalistic view which negates the idea of reward and punishment? You say, punish me for murder? I didn't murder him. God created the murder as it took place. His knowledge of the murder, his knowledge of this act created it directly. So where's my free choice, right? That's the question. According to the Chassidic notion of his knowledge, which is that his knowledge is united with the world and is really the source of the world. So how is this question answered? The Alter Rebbe answers this question. He answers this question in a famous mimer in his book Torah Or, a discourse on Parshas Vayera, one of the action-packed parshas of the Torah, talking about Avram and his various adventures, right? You have the binding of Isaac, and you have the 3 angels visiting him in the desert, and you have the destruction of Sodom, all sorts of interesting things in that parsha, right? And in that parsha, one of the things it says is the famous verse, Erdana, God says, I will descend and see what is going on in the city of Sodom. Right? Weird verse, right? God needs to descend and see. God's knowledge is perfect, right? I will descend and see how I will deal with them, right? Strange verse, Erdana. The Alter Rebbe explains as follows. There's knowledge and then there's knowledge. Really, the whole confusion, the whole difficulty arises from treating God's knowledge as really one thing, when in fact, as we have discussed in this discourse, which I cannot say this for a certainty, but it is profoundly my suspicion that this is the reason why this is the last topic in this mimer. Because with this, the Tzemach Tzedek is tying together very briefly everything he's spoken about in all 12 chapters of our discourse. Right? As we have spoken about at length, there are 2 types of knowledge. There's not just one knowledge. The entire issue arises from saying there's only one knowledge, when really there are 2 types of knowledge. There's the Rambam's description of God's knowledge, as we said before, that he and his knowledge are utterly one, that there really is just God. And then there is the Kabbalistic notion. And the fundamental point of the Alter Rebbe is that we don't choose between them. It's not that one was right and one was wrong. They are describing 2 different knowledges. Kikel, as it says, Kikel Deus Havaya. God is a God of knowledges or opinions, multiple. Right? Chassidus explains this, that there is 2 general types of knowledge. God knows in 2 ways. What is called Das Elyon, the higher knowledge, and Das Tachton, the lower knowledge. And these are essentially the knowledges described by Maimonides and by the Kabbalists. They're essentially 2 different, these are the 2 different knowledges. And by realizing that they are both right, but they're both talking about 2 different conceptions of God's knowledge, which are both true, we can resolve all of these questions and issues. So first of all, the lower knowledge is as follows. The lower knowledge is the knowledge that we describe in Kabbalah. God's lower knowledge of the world, in other words, his knowledge which is the emanated source, the godliness, the emanated worlds, as we describe often in this class, which become the source for the worlds, that are part of the process of creating the worlds, those emanations are the Das Tachton, generally speaking. These are the lower knowledge. God's lower knowledge is, as the Alter Rebbe describes, an active knowledge. When we say God knows in the active form, in the affirmative, not in the things are passively known to him, not that we say he's not ignorant in the negative, but rather we affirmatively say God knows. In an active sense, we are describing the lower knowledge. The lower knowledge, which is the knowledge that is united with the world and the source for everything in the world and is affected by the things that happen in the world and is changed by the things that happen in the world, this lower knowledge is the knowledge of Kabbalah. In the lower knowledge, he knows, the lower knowledge is what the verse is describing when it says Erdana. I will descend to deal with Sodom. Right? In other words, the short version of what the Alter Rebbe says in that mimer is that is that God already knew by dint of his omniscience what was happening in Sodom. But in order to deal out punishment, in other words, in order to actively know it, in order to interact with Sodom and bring upon them their punishment for all of their sins, right? There had to be a descent. He had to go lower, which means he had to know it not just by dint of his omniscience, by dint of being God, but with the lower knowledge, in elokus, in his expression, in his emanation. And in this lower knowledge, he interacted with the world. So the lower knowledge, the knowledge of Chassidus and Kabbalah, that Chassidus and Kabbalah describes, in this knowledge, God is actually actively involved in and creating the world. Now the question is, well, let's do the higher knowledge, and then we'll go. The higher knowledge is the knowledge as the Rambam described, that God has a knowledge of the world that is passive. In other words, we actually say in the davening, we say, Golui v'yadua, everything is revealed and known in the passive form. Not that he knows it or reveals it, right? It is revealed and is known to him. In other words, we're not saying that God actively does something. We're saying that just by existing, just by being, everything is simply known to God. Right? In other words, he knows everything simply by being God. The Rambam's description, the passive knowledge, the negative knowledge, where we say that he is just not ignorant, but we can't say he actively knows. Right? As the Rambam described, that knowledge is also true. That's the Das Elyon, that's the higher knowledge. And in that knowledge, it is true, he has absolute perfect knowledge of everything. He has absolute perfect knowledge of everything, but not in an active way. He knows everything simply by being God, but that doesn't mean that he is involved in the thing. Right? The thing is passively known to him. He is not involved in dealing with it, so to speak. He doesn't even know it in an active way. He knows everything, so to speak, implicitly, simply by being God. This is the higher level knowledge. And the truth is that at this level, the world is not really, that is actually the same level at which the world is not really truly relevant to him, so to speak. That is the level at which the world does not, quote unquote, matter to God. And yet everything is known to him. Right? That's the higher perspective from which the world is not really real, and the world is only real from a certain perspective. From that high vantage point, so to speak, from that inherent knowledge, that passive knowledge, God knows everything. But nothing in particular is important to him, so to speak. It is the lower knowledge in which he descends to be involved in the world, in which he descends to know the world in an active way. It is that knowledge which is the realm at which things are important to him, that he lowers himself down to be, so to speak, the God of the world. This is a different way we've spoken about these two levels in these classes. Right? There's the higher knowledge and the lower knowledge. Now, this beautifully solves most of our issues.
So it's like the difference between dreaming and being awake.
I don't know if that's the difference. But let me just follow my train of thought so I don't lose it. So the first question, the question of free choice, right? That God knows everything, and in fact God's knowledge is the source of everything, and yet everything is there. Man still has free will, right? The simple answer, the first answer that we gave, that God sees everything from beyond time, right? That God sees everything from that vantage point. That answer only works to a certain extent, right? It only works for one type of knowledge, right? That answer works for the knowledge which is not the source of everything, the knowledge which is passive, the knowledge which is transcendent. One second, I'll make sure I'm not getting this wrong. Pardon me. I think I just said that backwards. Let me say it again. Pardon me. It's a little difficult. 1 second. the simple answer that God knows everything because it has already happened, right? That answer is a sufficient answer for the lower level of knowledge. For the lower level of knowledge. For the level of God's knowledge where He is involved in the world, and when He is actively involved, and His knowledge is actually a faculty, that it's an emanation of His which is involved in the creation of the world. What do we say? We say that His knowledge is from a vantage point where everything has already happened to Him. The answer to the question of how can God know what we are going to do, but the choice is still free, the answer that everything has already happened and He is seeing it from outside of time, that answer only applies to the lower knowledge, to the Das Tachten. Because in the lower knowledge, in the active knowledge, He knows, he relates to everything in a limited way, not through his pure omniscience, not by dint of His essence, but rather He relates to everything in an active and particular and a limited way. So for that level of God's knowledge, it is sufficient to say that He knows everything because it has happened already. He sees it from a vantage point that is outside of time. In other words, or to put it more simply, when God lowers Himself down, so to speak, to be involved with the world, to be the creator of the world, when God lowers Himself down to be that active role of the creator, that lower position is itself outside of time, and everything that will happen has already happened, right?
You know what you said.
So one second. So why is the answer not sufficient for some people? Why does the Rambam not even give the answer and say the true answer is broader than the earth? Because the Rambam realizes that this answer is insufficient for God's true transcendent omniscience. When God is truly beyond even being the creator of the world, He's beyond even this active knowledge, but He rather has Das Elyon, the higher knowledge, the knowledge that comes from His own infinitude and His own self-knowledge, right? The logical answer that He knows everything, because it has already happened to Him in the past, does not apply. Because He is actually, at that level, He is actually totally transcendent of logic itself. Or to put it in different words, because that sounds very abstract, right? This is the level at which we say that God's knowledge of the thing causes the thing, rather than the thing being caused, rather than the thing causing God's knowledge, right? So in other words, let's put it a different way. When God lowers Himself down to be the creator of the world, when God lowers Himself down into the spheres to be an actual, to actually emanate the creation and to know it in an active way, like Erdana, I will descend and I will see what to do with Sodom. When He does that, He is essentially putting Himself in a position where He stands in an actual relationship with the creation. In other words, Sodom does something and it elicits from God punishment, right? In other words, the actions of Sodom cause God to punish Sodom. Right? They had a free choice, they made the wrong choice, they acted evilly, and so He decides to punish them, let's say. Right? So the question then becomes, so then how can they have free choice if he already knows what they're going to do? And the answer is that at that level, right, He sees what they have done already in the past. The simple answer applies, right? To punish them, He knew that He was going to punish them. He knew they were going to do the wrong thing because to Him it has already happened, right? But that answer is only at the level where God has lowered Himself down to actively deal with the creation. As opposed to before that, in Das Elyon, so that is quote-unquote before that, in Das Elyon, in the higher knowledge of God, where God knows everything simply by being Himself, the fact that we say that, the actions of Sodom caused God's knowledge, so they had true free choice, right? He didn't make them do it; they had the choice to do it, and then that caused his knowledge of it. It's just that he knows it outside of time, right? In the transcendent aspect of God's knowledge, in God's higher knowledge, that does not apply, because in God's higher knowledge, the very actions of Sodom, their choice to do these things, is also sourced in Him. Also has a root in God. That itself is created by God. In other words, the actions of Sodom are not the initial cause here. God causes the actions, and then the actions are known to Him, which means He really knows it in two stages, which is very similar to something we said last week about the Torah, by the way, which is the connection to this whole topic. There's really three stages. God knows what they are going to do in an essential way, in Das Elyon, in the higher knowledge. They actually do it. That actual action causes him to know it, but not to know it in the essential way, to know it in the lower way, in which he actually actively deals with the world and goes on to punish Sodom and send punishment to them. Right? So really it's a three-step process. You have Das Elyon, the higher knowledge. You have the actual world, and the world of action where things take place. And then you have the lower knowledge. Right? I said this is going to be wild stuff. So the lower knowledge is actually the knowledge for where the answer applies. So in other words, why did the Rambam ask the question and then not answer it? Because the Rambam realizes that the typical answer really only explains things if you accept that things which happen in the world cause God's knowledge of them. Right? When really the Rambam knew that things that happen in the world are themselves caused by God's knowledge. They are themselves brought about. They are things which are brought into being also from God. That the actions of the one who does them incorrectly, even their free choice, their quote-unquote free choices, must themselves ultimately emanate from God's knowledge. So the answer, the simple answer, applies to God's lower knowledge. It applies to a framework in which actions come first, and then the knowledge of the actions comes second. But in the broader framework, the ultimate framework, the one that the Rambam describes, in which God is the knower, the knowledge, and the known, and He knows everything simply by being Himself, the world derives from Him, and not vice versa. The knowledge comes first, the knowledge causes what happens to happen, which is why the Rambam cannot write an answer to this question. It stands open-ended. The question of how can it be that we have free choice if God knows, at the higher level, at Das Elyon, where we realize that everything derives from his knowledge of it, that question stands. And even the Raavad acknowledges this by saying that this is only a partial answer. I will partially answer this question with the simple answer. The simple answer ultimately does not hold, because God is beyond the framework of having to know things because they happened. In fact, the truth at the highest level is almost the exact opposite. Things happen because He knows them. But He knows them, and at that level the question stands. That's why the Rambam doesn't answer the question. That's basically the free choice. Yes, it's left as a question.
So,
that's the
other
issue.
thing, though, I was going to say earlier, is free choice. As you said earlier, God knows what's happening before and after, because He can see it through time when He visits. That's why He reviews time.
I'm not sure that God visits. I don't know what that means.
When He looks at it, or so how does He know?
How does He know?
Whatever it is what determines that He knows it happened. But what I'm saying is, maybe He doesn't know what's going on in our minds at this time. So He watches and says, "Oh, you did that. Now I know what you did." Or
right, but that's
going to shul. But I know you're going to shul. You're going to learn something, but He doesn't know what.
Yeah, but that's the exact question. The question is that everything that exists ultimately derives from Him in His higher knowledge. Everything that exists, everything that happens ultimately derives from God. Right? So the question is how can He not know? Of course He knows. He knows everything by dint of knowing Himself, as the Rambam describes, which is why the Rambam still has a question. Right? That's why the Rambam doesn't answer. The Rambam doesn't have an answer because his question is not the simple question. His question is not if God knows my actions like a human being knows my actions, how can it be that I also have free choice? His question is, if God knows my actions the way God knows my actions, how can I have free choice? Because God's knowledge is ultimately absolute, it would seem, and everything in the creation derives from it.
Against religion.
Why?
Because the average, well, at least in the human level, the average human being who says prayers wants to have a connection
Absolutely.
to a God that wants to know what you think.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
why bother if he already knows it?
Yeah.
It's a very good question.
And that blows away.
No, the question of why to pray is a very good question. It's not really a problem for religion per se, right? In other words, there's all sorts of very flippant answers I could give you, but I think the real question is a good question. The real question of why we pray in general is a very good question. It's not really a question based on this. It's a question in general. What's the purpose of prayer? If you deserve something, it's already coming to you. If you don't deserve it, praying's not going to fix that. So what's the point of prayer in general, right? If you're asking for things, right? It's a whole. That's a genuine question. I think it's a question of a different. I don't think it's the exact same question as here. On the contrary, I mean, you could argue that this means God is very, very interested in you. In fact, He's so interested in you that He is actively causing you to do everything you do at all times. Right? The question is then on free choice. But that doesn't mean you're far from God. On the contrary, that means you are intimately, very close with God. You're so close to God that you have no separate action apart from Him at all. So you could say that's a very lofty thing. So it's a very high thing. Well, if you wanted.
But it's easier to fathom.
Yeah.
That proper actions are consistent with God's motives.
I'm not sure what that means.
Well, that would mean that God has a sense of destiny and history, even if God would know everything in the future, past and present, at the same time.
Right.
But that would imply that there has to be some result that is, I guess, intended.
I could say that if I've done it, it was God's will, couldn't I? If it happens to pass, then it's God's will, even if it's something terrible. Right? You could say.
Maybe so, but to the extent that we actually make a choice about things.
That's the whole question. The question is whether we do make a choice about things. What does it mean to make a choice about things? So let's learn. We're way over time. Let's learn the last few lines of this discourse, please. Let's learn what we have to learn here. We are on page 382. Last line in 382. It is the third to last page in your packet. Umizem Muvan, says the Tzemach Tzedek, the holy Tzemach Tzedek says, from this we can understand, from this, if you'll recall, was a discussion of the two levels of Torah, which roughly correspond to the Das Elyon and Das Tachton, which we are describing, the higher knowledge and the lower knowledge, that there is a Torah which is the source of the world, and then there is a Torah which reflects the world after the actions of the world have already taken place. There's these two levels in Torah. So from this we can understand, we can understand a little bit the concept of knowledge and free choice. Because knowledge, God's omniscience, God's knowledge of everything, is in, how does He know everything? He knows it in Adam Kadmon, in Akudim, in the highest world, where all of the spheros are as one expression, right? In the single glance, as Spencer called it earlier, that He sees all of time in one glance, in one instant. Nevertheless, this does not compel choice, because choice is here below. When the action has already been drawn forth as a particular from that general emanation, right? Or in other words, God knows everything because He sees all of time at once. And your choice is free because your choice actually takes place within time after it has been drawn forth from that general expression. In other words, if I'm not mistaken, this is a Kabbalistic framing of the simple answer. Right? In other words, God knows everything in advance, God sees all the time at once, and yet your choice is still free because your choice takes place in the world of particulars. In other words, in our lowest physical world. Right? So God sees it all as if it has already happened, and yet you make the free choice within time. Right? As we said. According to this, we can also understand very well, we can understand how time is subsumed in that which transcends time, because time is created through contractions and divisions of the divine influence, of the divine light, as we've been describing, right? That time is emanated all at once, and then it is divided into smaller and smaller emanations. Each one of these emanations has a contraction and then an expansion, right? The pulse which is behind all of time. And since all of these contractions and all of these emanations, in other words, this entire process which creates time, is only from our perspective, before him, everything is as if it is not. In other words, he stands beyond the entire process of time. Indeed, even the source of time, he stands beyond. Just how to him, as we said last week, from his perspective, it is exactly as it was before the world was created. So too time is of no importance. You were the same before the world was created, and you are the same after the world was created. Right? Which this is the ultimate, this is the Das Elyon, this is the higher perspective by which God is simply himself and the world is an afterthought, the world doesn't have any true reality, right? Apart from him, apart from his knowledge of himself, right? As we've been describing, he is exactly the same before the world is created and after the world is created. The creation of the world does not change him at all. It is as if it has no literal existence. Just as space is just time is irrelevant, just as space is. To the extent that he is the space of the world. In other words, the entire world takes place within the existence of God. It has no independent reality. Vidal, and this will be sufficient this is enough for a person who understands. This is enough for a person of understanding, says the Tzemach Tzedek, and that is how our discourse ends. Let us read the synopsis of chapter 12. In this section, the Tzemach Tzedek continues the explanation of the principle that God is above time, and elaborates on the concept of the order of time, or the source of time, that exists in the spiritual realms. The Tzemach Tzedek explains that the manner in which time comes into being also follows the same pattern as that of particular entities coming into being from a general category. Right? The time reflects the division of the spiritual energies. There's a general light that includes all the particular created beings as one, and this same light also includes all the units of time as one. This rung is identified with the level of Adam Kadmon, this primordial man, at which God gazed and surveyed all existence until the end of time in one glance. This one glance includes the entire span of the 6 millennia of the world's existence. Afterwards, from this glance, there is a division into several lesser units, each representing a different emotional attribute and including a large span of time. For example, the first millennium is identified with the attribute of chesed, of kindness. Thus it is said, "For in your eyes 1,000 years are like a yesterday that has passed." For each of these divisions, referred to as days, includes a millennium. This is what is meant by the expression, the order of time, used by the Midrash. The order of time is the source of time in the supernal worlds. Afterwards, these lesser levels of light divide into even smaller units, with each unit including a long span of time, but less than the previous level. So, for example, on Rosh Hashanah, the first day of the year, a light that includes the entire span of 365 days in one glance is drawn down. Afterwards, the light is further divided into 12 Rosh Chodashim, 12 heads of the month, with each Rosh Chodesh including the span of 29 or 30 days. Afterwards, it is divided into days, and then from days into hours. God's essence, by contrast, is above time entirely. Moreover, he has no connection to the order of time of Atzilus. Indeed, the existence of time is of no consequence to him. As we say in our prayers, you were the same before the world was created, and you are the same after the world has been created. So this is the capstone. This is the sort of the bookend on this whole discourse. Next week, God willing, we're going to do sort of a broad overview of all 12 chapters, God willing. Just a very short sort of summary of everything we've learned in this discourse and sort of what the general gist of the discourse is. In other words, what bringing together everything that Tzemach Tzedek says in the discourse. And then the week after that, God willing, we will start a new mimer. We will start something new in this class, God willing.